I left last week's episode in a pretty tumultuous place. I realized live while recording that I still held resentment and anger for what happened to me in Sweden. And it threw me for the rest of the week up until yesterday. In fact, I normally record this episode on a Monday. I just couldn't do it. I was still reeling from the question or the idea. It was all really strange because generally in my life now I'm contented and calm, and life feels to be normal for the first time in as long as I can remember. And I simply didn't know what to do with that realization. It actually crept up on me live in the recording. You can hear me actually physically respond to it. This emotion, it overwhelmed me. And part of me almost wanted to not include that in the episode, but I felt it important because I sensed that it was something that I would want to share with you if I was able to work through it. I think it's important for me to be authentic in even in my struggles currently as they're happening. I want to be an example that vulnerability and learning is very much part of our journey. I carried it with me until, yes, quite recently. This is a Tuesday. I have to upload this episode in 2 hours. And I had a few conversations with some brothers back to back, actually. And one reached out randomly just to touch base. And again, his wisdom was paramount to understanding, knowledge, wisdom. And then a second call, which really helped me understand all of this in a proper context and in a way that made me appreciative of all that I have. And also to that brother, thank you so much. It really set the ship right for me. I think when we're lost at sea sometimes, it's okay. It's okay to just live in it and feel it and do your best to navigate it. And then at a certain point, you can be ready to address it. This is all part of that longer process of coming to understand who you are. So don't be afraid of the storm. Embrace it with courage. And when it becomes a little too much, that's the time to reach out. Welcome to the Sons of Men podcast, a conversation dedicated to meaning in the lives of men, offering a window into the trials of masculinity, where we talk about family, spirituality, creativity, and legacy to better understand each other and to offer solutions for the next generation in an increasingly shallow and hostile world. I'm your host, Curtis Wiebe, a father and husband, addict in lifelong recovery, and an advocate for men struggling in the shadow of suffering. This is episode 6, Dig 2 Graves. Well, the title of this episode is actually drawn from a fantastic quote. You know I love my quotes. If it's getting obnoxious, you can just let me know. But I always find it's a great framing device for what I want to talk about, and it centers my thinking. The quote is this: "Before you embark on a journey of revenge, dig 2 graves." This, of course, was said by Confucius, if you are familiar with his philosophy. It's a pretty, that's a pretty dark statement about the human condition. And I think the one that's extremely relevant to essentially the idea that I was holding on to deep anger and realizing when I admitted to my friend that second call that I mentioned that I wanted those who had hurt me to suffer. And if I was being really honest, I wanted to be involved in their downfall. Now, I'm not proud to admit that, but I had to grapple with that after the recording of the last episode. I had to be honest and own my own emotions and my own feelings around it. It was true. And even now, there's a part of me that still wishes for that. But I think by the end of this episode, maybe I'll find some kind of catharsis. I hope. So bear with me. I want to talk about the catalyst of all of this. And there were more than one episodes in this experience. And I think it has to do with some of the greater problems in the corporate world. I've talked about it, on and off throughout these episodes. And I think it is a real problem in the corporate world where we are inundated with weak leadership and weak men. But I want to talk about my personal catalyst to what eventually led to the feelings I described just moments before. I was working at a studio, as I mentioned, and it all started with an ongoing problem of disorder, confusion, and a general state of devastated morale within everyone that worked on the team. There was this distinct environment of words never matching actions, which now to me is an obvious red flag and something that I look for right away when someone speaks big words and makes eloquent statements and is very grandiose in their ambitions, but does no work to back it up. This had led to a real devastation for my teammates and the people that I was ultimately responsible for. And I'd chosen to serve them because I could see quite clearly that my skill set and my ability to tell story or write, it wouldn't have an impact at this studio. So I did what I could. I decided to take action on behalf of my team, even though I didn't think it would really make a difference. It was an action that I wanted to make aware to the higher level managers at the studio who I was and who my teammates were and what skills we could offer to contribute and help with a lot of this disorder that we were seeing. A team of writers, what we were capable of, and how ultimately we could contribute to the development of this specific project. But you have to understand that this was in a system of disorder, and there felt, I know there was a intentional fusion being spread. What do I mean by that? There was a lot of work being done, but there was no firm direction which it was being built towards. And so direction would change from week to week. And I think, again, maybe I actually believe that there was full knowledge of it from essentially the head of the studio. And nothing was being done about it. So I put together this plan to say, here's how I can help, and here's how my teammates can help. When you work in an environment like this, paranoia and distrust and rumor mongering are at epidemic levels, and no action can be seen as anything but that. And I was pulled into a private meeting. And again, this is often how these types of environments work. They isolate people, and it's triangulating, and everyone's having private conversations. These are red flags, by the way. If you're finding yourself being taken away from your team and sternly talked to, just be aware. But I was essentially pulled aside by one of the head directors, and I was threatened. My career was threatened because I suppose he felt that I was going above him and that I was going to expose him. I'm still not entirely sure. But the reality was I was threatened for trying to help my team and genuinely help the project. It was it was pretty traumatizing. I spoke last episode about having this desire to bring people together, to collaborate and create with this kind of jazz-like feeling. And this moment was fundamentally, I suppose it rewrote the way I saw the world. I could hardly understand why I was privately being threatened for really just trying to help once again. So, what happened? I'm not going to get long in the tooth here on this story. It's not really, this isn't to expose anyone. This isn't for me to call it out, because this whole episode is about what to do with this sort of grief, I suppose you could call it. The long story short is that the company buried me. I was told over and over again how much this director loved working with me. Of course, those words and actions never matched. It was now my job to fix what had happened. This misunderstanding, it was on me to forgive. And eventually I was completely isolated. I was no longer being assigned to work, and no one reached out to me. This was also during the time when the studio was shut down due to COVID. So I was home alone for weeks on end, and eventually I just left. Now, I wrote and documented everything. It burns a hole on my hard drive to this day, and numerous times throughout the years, I came so close to sending it to a games journalist website to expose what was happening at that studio and to get revenge on the person who threatened me and to destroy him. But I never did. And to be honest, I don't know why. Because I think in the mindset that I had back then, it's actually surprising that I held on to it. And maybe in the end, I'm glad. So what was the cost of this? What was the cost of this grief or this trauma? I became obsessed. Work consumed my thoughts and my life. It's all I could talk about. And because I was home working from our small apartment in Stockholm, there was no escape from it for my family. I remember very distinctly a moment when my young daughter, she would have been 6 at the time, started talking about the bad men at work. And I knew in that moment I had crossed the line, but I couldn't move past it. I would talk about it with my close friends, and if I didn't get the sympathy that I felt I deserved, it would burn a hole in me of anger and resentment, this poison, and it was spilling out of me. It was becoming my identity. I fell back into addiction. I fooled myself into this idea of casually drinking again. If you are a recovered addict, you know what I'm talking about. It is always looking for a way back in. And we're excellent liars. We are so good at lying to ourselves. Fellow addicts, you know what I'm talking about. I had a really strange dream one night when all of this was at its worst. I could barely sleep. My anxiety was just through the roof, and my thoughts racing. It was a difficult time, brothers. I was truly at my weakest, but I had this incredible dream, and I read it as a warning. And I woke up from this dream, and I realized in that moment that I had relapsed. The lie came to light. It was early. I think it was 5 a.m. My wife was still sleeping, and I had to get up and get ready to go to work. So I just nudged her, and I said, I'll let you sleep. I just want you to know that I realize that I've relapsed on alcohol. And she looked at me and nodded, and she said, I know. All of this was stewing in a hatred that had permeated my life, every nook and cranny. It had tainted the way I saw the world, this resentful, spiteful hatred. I didn't want to create anymore. I was angry about it because people, I saw them as hating creative people. I think there was some truth to it, but it made me hateful of being creative. It made all my work angry and cynical. And if you've read any of my work, you know that that's not really where I like to live as a creative. I started to hate people, which is the inverse of my heart. I hated people who didn't seem to care or thought it wasn't so serious. They carried on as though nothing was wrong. How could you? You know what they've done to me. Why don't you understand? And I reveled in hearing other people's stories about their experiences in this studio. And I have to be honest, it wasn't out of any sympathy, but it validated my own hatred and spite. This led to a simmering rage in my heart that was starting to temper me towards maybe an ultimate purpose, but I couldn't see the forest for the trees here. I was consumed, and it was only by the grace of the brothers in my life in Sweden, some great friends who were patient with me and loving, my family, my wife, who really helped me navigate some of these. These are genuine toxic people, but she had such wisdom and insight to help me navigate it for my sanity and also to protect me. But this rage would go unabated, and in fact, I would feel it festering up until last week. In some way, it was still there, because months and years had passed, and this director, who I saw as not only a bad leader, but largely responsible for a lot of the failures that happened at that studio, he left and went on to start his own company in the same role he'd failed at to, I would say, an unbelievable degree. And then I saw his new company get funding. And then my pride and my anger and my rage was a venom in my throat. And the audacity. How could he even pretend to wear that hat? Has he learned nothing? And the injustice. Oh, I can feel it in me now. I can feel he paid nothing for that failure. He was, in some senses, rewarded, moved on to bigger and better things. And I was left facing that at the end of the last episode, staring at that injustice in the face and in my heart. My injustice was left unresolved. There was no vindication for me to see someone in my perspective undeserving of a richness and success, and me still left picking up the pieces. There was no catharsis for me, a release from this grief and pain in any satisfying way. But then I'm reminded of dig two graves. The reality was that my desire for the ruin of another led to ruin in my own life. I was racked with this obsessive anger, reveling in the company's continued failure. I would talk to staff that still worked there, and rather than being sympathetic to their plights, I would take great delight in hearing about the continued lack of direction and frustration that people were feeling. My own household was wrapped up in my darkness. I wasn't protecting my child from adult concerns. It led to stagnation in my creative life. I couldn't channel any wisdom or knowledge into the work that I was creating. It was purely anger, which made it shallow and ultimately quite meaningless. I was constantly seeking to expose the truth as though it would fix everything. I could expose him, expose them all, the cover-up and the indifference, the rejection of my claim. And in all this, it left me cold, cut off, and spiritually frozen. I was dead in a grave. I realized throughout this past week that I hadn't transformed those experiences or forgiven them. Sometimes there's no justice for our suffering. This past Sunday, I was at Mass, and I'm incredibly blessed to have a very wise leader in the father of the parish. He gave a very compelling homily about suffering. And he phrased it in such a fantastic way that I can't help but share, because it was part of the healing process leading to this episode. He said, when it comes to suffering, it is not in the question of answering why. Why has this happened to me? But how? How will I take this and learn from it? What was this meant for? How do we use this to learn about ourselves and see an opportunity to transform ourselves with wisdom? This does not excuse the treatment or behavior of others. Don't get me wrong. I think I covered that pretty well in the last episode. All this does is it allows us to control what it does to our lives. And I think you can see evidently what can happen if you let it poison you. No, I refuse that. I refuse that power in my life. What is left then but transformation? I realized yesterday that I've been building the solution to this pain for 2 years already. Some of you may be familiar with something that I've been working on called Vast Vision, a publishing company. It all began with the idea of a warm, inviting campfire for storytellers. Do you see it? Warm, open, and full of light. I wanted to create a publisher that values art and creative people. I want to lead my team and those that we work with through strong relationships, trust, and service. I've been building it the entire time, the past 2 years. So why now? Why only now do I see it differently? Why only yesterday? Even though I've been working towards this quietly for years. Well, it was a brother. Through his own struggles with his thoughts of vengeance And his statement that sometimes in this life there is no justice as we would want it. Instead, we turn that emotion and intention to something good to make the world a better place. I am already building a solution. These experiences fueled my desire to build a better way, to treat people with kindness. It created in me a refusal to accept that status quo. I know there's a better way because of what I endured. That, my brothers, is transformation. And I'm as new to this as you are. This is as fresh as yesterday, and only in the reflection now. I want to share 4 real quick key points of wisdom that is the takeaway from my experiences of what I saw, of what I endured, and what I will tell you now as a way to transform yourself, if you've had these kinds of experiences, into a good man who leads by serving. Action. I don't talk about making things. I simply do the work. Hey, I have struggles here myself, even recently. But I'm starting to really believe in the value of quietly doing the work. And if you are going to say it, make sure you do it. And do it better than you promised. Clarity. Be clear about your intentions to those around you. Make sure they understand what it is you need. That you have excellent clarity in your voice and words. And if you fail and they misunderstand, and there are failures around you because of this lack of clarity, just admit you were wrong, which leads me to point 3, accountability. A strong man is accountable. Take the blame for where you have gone wrong. Do not be afraid to be wrong. And to that point, stand tall when you are earnestly sure you have not gone wrong. It's that fine balance. And finally, courage. Confront issues respectfully. If someone is causing you harm, or maybe there's tension between you, prepare your heart to listen and meet in the middle if necessary, but confront it with courage. Do not go behind people's backs. Do not start spinning stories to undermine this person. Be a man, step up with courage. And that's it. That's the answer to, I think, the revelation from last week. I can tell you I'm galvanized. I am this morning lit up with motivation and purpose. It feels transformed. Even now in the finale, I can feel the weight lift off my heart. I want to thank you for listening to me sort through some issues live in a recording. And maybe it helps you as well in something that you're battling with. There's no glory in a vengeful heart. It's only weight and suffering, and eventually you drown with it. Instead, I encourage you, my brothers, to light a warm fire. Be open. Be inviting. Tell a different story than the one that we're hearing so often now. Because I think everyone is getting pretty tired of it. Thank you for listening to the Sons of Men podcast. That is an interesting 2-episode journey, I have to admit. I'm surprised how even in these solo conversations, I am struck with new insight into my own failings. And I think that accountability, even though, I only talk to a few of you, it really keeps me centered. And I appreciate the opportunity to share with you. And I wait to hear your story as well. You can reach me at sonsofmenpod@gmail.com. I have recorded 3 guest episodes, which I'll be releasing staggered over the next several weeks and months. But I'd love for you to be part of that as well. Doesn't matter where you come from. I don't care if you're a blue-collar worker, if you are an office, if you're a corporate wage slave, or whatever. I'll meet you where you're at, brother. And we'll have a great conversation. And until we do, have a great week ahead. God bless.